We all love to play the hero in fantasy, particularly in our fantasy role-playing games. It's literally what we're there for. But when we're thinking about worlds and we're thinking about how something is constructed, you can't all be great heroes and legends. We can't all be the Michael Jordans of the fantasy universe. No, there has to be some people mopping up the mess, doing the grunt work, and ultimately doing the unpopular and sometimes unseemly things that keep a fantasy world functioning. Today, we're going to talk about the most important jobs in a fantasy world. Hello everybody, my name is Kyle, I am the Dork, and that makes you fine, beautiful people the desk. A couple of things. If you want to support the work that we do here, our Patreon is $10 a month. You get your own unique role-playing game that you can't get anywhere else. And then once that month is up, you can never get it again. Also, $3 a month gets you early access to our content, which is pretty cool. You can get physical copies of the RPGs that we have written over at Tabletop Bookshelf, and of course, through our partners, Indie Press, Revolution. And lastly, if you want to pick up a PDF of some of our games, you can do that over on itch.io. So let's talk about what we're discussing today. First things first, I want to talk about how some of these jobs, the ones that I think are really important, would work and would function in the Middle Ages. For those of you not in the know, I studied to be a medievalist. I have a medieval history degree. That's like kind of the thing that I thought I was going to do with my life, and instead I wound up making funny haha videos on the internet and writing role-playing games. Isn't the world weird? But I love talking about it. I love doing it to add stuff to our games. We're going to talk about how those jobs, or at least some of the most functionally important jobs at that time, would work, and how we could tie that into our stuff. We'll also, for the first time, going to be talking a little bit about high fantasy, because there are some concepts that I want to play around with based on some shows that I have been enjoying. And lastly, what would be the best job for a person, let's say you or I, going into a fantasy world? We're going to call this person Steve. Everyone say hi, Steve. You have no idea, by the way, how much weird joy I found in finding the most scuffed stock photos ever for Steve, but Steve is going to be our surrogate, our stand-in for the wonderful worlds that we are going to explore today. And I'm going to put Steve into some of these careers and see which one he's going to like. I'm like Gandalf if he ran a guidance counseling thing for high schoolers and had to help them with career placement. Gandalf the unpaid. But there's a reason I'm using Steve. You and I might be above average in some cases or some ways, but we are far more likely to be a regular person than we are to be a fantasy hero. And our boy Steve has far more in common with Aragorn's cloak than he does with Aragorn himself. So I'm not going to be giving him the kinds of amazingly cushy jobs that one might expect. And of course, Steve is going to rate these jobs based on his satisfaction. Good luck, Steve. With that out of the way, let's talk about one of the things I think does get glossed over quite a bit. It's sort of a thankless job, but the idea of being a miller is a huge deal in medieval societies. Obviously, not everybody had access to the technology, the space, and the upfront capital to make millstones to grind their bread, and grinding your bread by hand was a tedious and sometimes dangerous process if you were unable or unskilled enough to make your own flour. You could make it really poorly, it could grind down your teeth, it could actually hurt your jaw muscles. We have evidence of some of that happening, so a good miller is worth their weight in gold. And being a miller is one of the most useful things you can have. Everybody in a fantasy world needs to eat, and most places in medieval Europe turned to things like wheat and barley as a way to make sure that their peasants got an amount of nutrients that were sufficient to keep them going. It's important for us to realize that as more and more nation states grow in the early medieval period and they're trying to feed people, the stuff that they're using and the people like the millers that they become dependent on continues to grow. It's also important for us to talk about this, but if you ever think about how medieval stonemasons would essentially make their version of concrete, or the mortar that would be used to help build everything from the castle walls to the new well for the village alderman, a lot of times the process of grinding up the necessary stone materials for those building projects would also fall to the miller. So everybody needs to eat, and A lot of people continue to want to build things, so the miller is actually not only one of the most useful people in the world, but they're one of the most stable jobs. And they actually existed for a number of reasons. Infrastructure during the Middle Ages is really difficult, and let's be real, building a substantial infrastructure in a fantasy world beset by monsters is also probably difficult, so it makes sense for only a select few people to shoulder that kind of burden. And again, in some cases, it's linked to those feudal societies. Those people had a class divide, and so not everybody got the opportunity to be a miller, but they are, as I've mentioned, essential, both because A, they use very useful life-saving tasks, and because so many people were busy working the fields or tending to other tasks, it made sense to have one person specialize. Now, let's talk about this. Would this work in a fantasy world? And my answer is heck to the yes. Let's be real here for a second. There's a lot of pros for being a miller in a fantasy world. While everyone is out fighting and gallivanting against dragons or monsters or whatever else you're sort of battling against, somebody has to be at home to bake the bread to keep everyone that makes the adventuring economy alive, right? Adventurers need assistants, they need alchemists, they need armorers, they need everything about a fantasy world, and that sort of falls apart without a vast, sustainable, nutrient-dense food source to be provided to them. Things like barley bread and things like wheat bread. Adventurers are never going to go to a stereotypical walled fantasy town with another adventurers guild if there's not mortar that's ground up by the miller to make the walls and the guild hall for said stereotypical fantasy town. They're going to be, in fact, I think, more useful in a fantasy world than they are going to be in a regular one. Because if everyone is out fighting and battling for treasure, somebody still has to be home to bake the bread. I think that matters quite a bit. Also, it makes sense too if you're a peasant in this kind of world to aspire to being a miller, because let's be real here, if you have no real fighting skills and no magical ability, this is a really useful way to attain wealth and status. There's a reason, at least here in the US and in Western Europe, that there are so many people who have Miller or Milner as their last names. These individuals were relatively wealthy by peasant standards or by common folk standards, and could supply their own food, which meant that they had a larger chance of surviving and continuing to make kids. This is a sustainable, stable, relatively affluent position for somebody who doesn't have the kinds of skills necessary to go out and kick evil in the crotch. I think it's kind of useful, and a lot of people in a fantasy world might aspire to be this kind of person. Now, there are some cons to being a miller in some way, shape, or form. Miller's thumb is an actual real physical ailment, because one of the millers who actually would work would sift the thumb, or would sift the wheat, the chaff, between their thumb and their forefinger as a way of testing to see how fine it was. Over the years, it would literally broaden and flatten the thumb. This is also potentially, this is conjecture zone here, where the idea of a quote-unquote golden touch comes in, because although, yeah, we have the Midas touch, but millers who were very good at figuring out the fineness of grain, whether that's the grains of stone for mortar or the grain of bread, were said to have a golden thumb, or sometimes a golden grasp, which I think is kind of cool. Maybe potentially, again, this is conjecture zone here, but maybe potentially another one of those sources for the idea of a golden touch, golden important thing. I thought that was kind of cool. Moving on from that, however, there is another con, and that is the idea that, unfortunately, in times of famine and peril, a lot of times the first target for individuals is the miller themselves. In times of desperation, famine, or crop failure, a lot of times the peasantry would turn their pitchforks and torches at the miller, somebody who lacked the protection of nobility or armed guards, somebody who was, unfortunately, not like a merchant, locked into one area and couldn't exactly bring the mill with them, and as such is a pretty easy fitting target or scapegoat for a very angry peasant populace. It's a big deal, and again, even though this person does a decent service during good times, they can be a very good scapegoat during bad times. But with all that said, let's check in with our boy Steve. Let's see how Steve is doing in his new internship as the miller. Well, Steve kind of kills that sense of class consciousness in his head and decides that he's going to be like, you know what, I'd rather be the dude making the bread than the guy tilling the fields, and he gets himself an apprenticeship. He presses down all of those thoughts and all images of watching other people burn down the last windmill, and he decides to throw his lot in with the Millers Guild. And over time, it's a pretty lucrative career for our boy Steve. It's stable, it's simple, he's able to buy himself some luxuries, a nice carriage. He's even able to hire one of those fancy pants tutors for his now several ungrateful children that are benefiting from the stability and the relative affluence that Steve provides. All in all, it's kind of a boring job for old Stevie boy, but you know what? He still likes it anyway. He gives it 7 slightly burning structures out of 10. Now, we're going to talk about something else, which is leatherworkers. Now, this is something that I think gets glossed over a lot when we think about a medieval world or a fantasy world, but leather in many ways is both the thing that figuratively and literally binds a lot of stuff together, and leatherworkers, tanners in general, made all kinds of essentials for everyday life and living. Things like belts and shoes, sure, but also the harnesses and straps that were essential for military equipment, or the relatively important things like reins for horses, harnesses for farming. All of these things were dependent on the reliable, stable, and strong material that is leather. And everything from those belts to the things that you need gets made by the leatherworker. So again, would this work in a fantasy world? And the answer is another resounding yes. Somebody in the universe has to make all of the belts and straps on the robe for our edgy warlocks. How else are they going to look like they came out of a ye old hot topic? It's a grim job, but someone's got to do it. And there's a lot of pros to being a leatherworker. The first pro is that, again, you make one of the most widely used substances in the Middle Ages, full stop, period. And again, this is important for us to make note of right now. It's really usable for straps. Leather armor like this did not exist historically. This is garbage. I want you all to know that. I hit my mic. That's how much I'm gesticulating right now. But this is literal trash. This is not going to keep you safe from anything. In some cases, leather can be used as backing for a breastplate or for mail in general, but raw leather armor like this, or the leather armor that you see in popular fantasy games, is horrific. This is some of the most useless crap imaginable, and it was not real. This didn't exist, right? So when you think leather, I need you not to think this malarkey, and I need you to think more useful things. Leather is the stuff that binds, straps, ties together, or is useful to cinch everything around it. It's not being used to make stuff like this, right? If you show up with that, you're gonna be it's gonna be like that, how you doing, fellow kids, but in the ye old speak, which I think is really funny. Now I'm envisioning Steve Buscemi as a rogue, and he just sneaks by because of his ennui. People are just they don't perceive him because Steve Buscemi's presence just is I don't really want to be here. That'd be incredible. Steve Buscemi, man, hit me up. I got you. But with that out of the way, leather does wind up in literally everything. If you can think of it in a medieval town or in the Middle Ages in general, chances are some amount of leather is involved, whether it's the scraps of fabric that you wear or the things that you need for medical or military equipment. The best modern parallel that I can draw is the sort of ubiquity of things like semiconductors and microchips in our everyday life. We don't tend to think about this being used in everything from our cars to our LED displays to the navigational software in our GPS to the actual steering software in some of our vehicles to semiconductors are everywhere just because we don't see them, in a way that leather is kind of everywhere in the Middle Ages. It sort of is an ever-functioning, ever-present material, and because of that, there is a consistent, strong demand for it, which means, ultimately, it does work, it does function as a fantasy job. Now, here's the thing, though. There are a lot and I mean a lot of cons about being a fantasy leatherworker. And the first one really is how you made leather in the Middle Ages. Some of you have probably heard the old adage, we were so poor we didn't have a pot to piss in. And that actually comes from a relatively decent practice of the poor or the less fortunate bringing urine in buckets or pots to leather workers and tanners so that they can use the ammonia present in that urine to help them make the leather. Yes, you can literally sell your own human bodily fluids to help make rogue equipment, essentially, is what I'm trying to tell you, which is crazy work to think about. And for those of you who don't know, this ammonia is used in a bunch of different ways. Ammonia can be used to remove the fur from animal hide to help prepare it for the process. And the ammonia can also be used to wash away lime and other acidic materials that would have been used to cure the leather during that leather working process. I'm oversimplifying this a lot, by the way, but again, they needed a lot of ammonia, and it just turns out that if you're living in a town and village, there are people who just kind of produce a lot of ammonia just by existing and going to the bathroom, and so that's the stuff that you get to use. As one can imagine, this carries with it a myriad wealth of health issues. Constantly being exposed to a wealth of human bacteria from a myriad different sources is, how do I put this nicely? Big sad for your health. Imagine getting vibe checked by bacterium at a pretty decent clip. It is not bussin', for real, on God. And now that I've made half of our audience cringe to death, I do want you to consider that literally these are people who are exposing themselves in contact with human waste product on a daily basis for work. And on top of the actual physical toll that this would take, I need you to understand that it comes with a social, a cultural toll as well. These people reeked of human urine, right? Their smells, the noxious fumes, the propensity for disease all makes being a leather worker, a tanner, anybody who's involved in that line of work incredibly undesirable to be around. We have accounts of the stench literally hanging over some of these dwellings, or literally hanging on to some of these people. Those of you who have worked with infants or in a daycare will know exactly what happens when some kid has an accident and doesn't make it to the bathroom and tracks it all over the carpet. Yet stench lingers. Imagine that times 100. And so as a result, not only were these people kind of social outcasts, in many cases, people like tanners would be shunted to the edges of polite society, in some cases quite literally. So there's a lot of cons associated with being any one of the leatherworking professions during this time if you're going for a more historically accurate approach. Now, with that out of the way, let's check in on old Stevie boy and see how he's doing. Well, Steve starts feeling pretty ill the second he steps into the tannery, and it's not long before our boy is curled up around whatever version of a chamber pot he manages to find in this fantasy world. The money is good, but the hours and the work are grueling, and the social status of it is, frankly speaking, abysmal at best. Steve gets it 3 horrible uses of modern slang out of 10. You know what's not horrible? You know what's absolutely fantastic? Our sponsor for today's video, our old pals over at Tales from Elsewhere. Yes, they got Steve dressing up like a cowboy because he's so excited that their new game is officially funded on Kickstarter. If you are looking for a Weird West style of role-playing game, one that features evocative and interesting ways to tie your character's backstory into the game, one that is made by a wonderful team of incredible artists, designers, layout editors, just good people in general, and one that features some of the coolest production value that I have ever seen in a game. Again, I have talked about this before, but I really love that there's printable interactive menus that look like a demented version of the Old West Sears catalog. I that's so strong evocatively. I just adore it. Again, if you're looking for an incredible rules light game with a lot of cool little horror elements, I think this is an absolute slam dunk. You can check the description or the link in the description below, I should say. See, I get really excited about it because, again, I've said it before on all the sponsorships for this game, I am a backer. This is not just some random game or some random company that's like, hey, here's some money to promote our product. I legit bought the game. I am excited to play the game. It's gonna be a rip roaring good time. It's certainly gonna be as good of a time as our boy Steve had a bad time out in the tannery. But in all legitimacy, guys, if you're interested in this kind of a game, check the link in the description below. Give them some support. Tell them we sent you. I think this game is going to be absolutely amazing. And with that out of the way, let's get back to our regularly scheduled programming. And our regularly scheduled programming is actually pretty irregular, at least for me. Usually, I do a lot of talking about low fantasy, and today, we're going to be delving into the high fantasy. I want to jump right into a world where myth and magic are everywhere, and I want to talk about janitors, gosh darn it. That's right, the people that clean your trash. Your boy's first foray as a YouTuber, as a game designer, as an RPG person, in this space, and I'm talking about the trash man. But I honestly think it makes a ton of sense. In a wonderful fantasy world, the janitor, I think, is actually critical to how things would go down and how things would matter, right? And let's be real here for a second. In a horrific place where battle, whether it's magical or mundane, happens constantly and consistently, people are going to be needed to clean up that mess. I'm not even gonna lie to you though, as horrific as thinking about it is, I was more inspired by a wonderful little anime called Kaiju Number 8. This show features, I think, although it's more sci-fi, features some pretty cool fantasy elements, particularly the idea that several nations have developed their own programs for cleaning up the destroyed kaiju that exist all around them. And it got me thinking, in a fantasy world with tons of powerful monsters, with god-level threats, with leviathans running around shooting lightning bolts, even in a world with that kind of magic and power, you're gonna need somebody to clean up that mess. And on the surface, it doesn't look like a very glamorous job, right? You have a lot of gore and guts to get cleaned up. You have a lot of big, scary dragon scales to sweep away. But then I started to think about the economic ramifications of having something like that happen. And let's be real, if you're the one cleaning up the mess, you're probably the one being able to salvage all of the useful parts from a monster quite like that one. And those cleaners probably, over time in a fantasy world, I would imagine, if it works even a little bit like our own, would become really adept at figuring out what components from the monster need to be disposed of and what can be repurposed into powerful equipment. And if they're able to do that, they're probably able to parlay that equipment into personal use, making themselves an actual legitimate threat, or more likely, selling it to individuals with real combat experience who want a consistent source of strong, powerful, above-grade equipment based on those magical properties. And then I thought, well, shoot, how many wizards, sorcerers, witches, and powerful spellcasters wind up using magic in all kinds of ways from the parts of the monster? It's no real stretch here to think that a guild or a merchant group that specializes in cleaning up after these massive monster battles, after, the royal heroes take out the dragon, after the demon lord is struck down, those individuals are probably able to strike up lucrative partnerships with spellcasters all over this fantasy world to get access to the freshest, most exotic, and in some cases hard to source reagents and components for their incantations, potions, and other spells. I think what this means is that over time, what you have is a group that starts doing the kind of socially unacceptable work that a leatherworker or a tanner would do, and over time is able to parlay the magical nature of that, coupled with the fact that there's not a lot of people who want to do that work, to become a powerful financial force in a fantasy world. If I'm going to draw a real-life modern parallel, they're less like the warriors of myth and legend, and they're more like the kinds of people that clean up after a giant mess, because let's be real here for a second, no one cares if the realm is saved if the rotting carcass of Gargalak, the god shark, is still rotting in some field somewhere. Again, a good modern parallel for this are our modern trash collectors, right? If you've ever been to a major US city that is dealing with a garbage strike or a sanitation strike from their sanitation union, you will understand the kind of power that those individuals have in those areas. Imagine that, but on a giant, massive, magical, global scale. How crazy would it be that your players are having to go through an adventure brought about by the collapse of union negotiation talks as they're working with the king to get a new contract, and the players have to constantly take stamina damage because they're keeping their mouths covered so they don't breathe in noxious, decomposing dragon fumes? That is so wild to me, and I think it would be absolutely amazing. But we have a second option as well for our high fantasy nerds, and that is the dungeon cleaner. I was inspired because, as most of you know if you watch, I try my best to reply to as many comments as I can, but we were talking about this in the comments, but dungeons, as like we think about them right now, are way too clean. If you pick up a modern fantasy role-playing game with a couple exceptions, shout out my goat, Shadow of the Demon Lord, most dungeons, most crypts, most things look way too pristine. Seriously, there are vaults in Skyrim that look nicer than some homes that I have been to. Legitimately, right? These are places that have very little ventilation, that have either things that are actively decomposing or adventurers and monsters that will soon be decomposing in them, and yet they're not bacteria-ridden scum hives. I don't understand how that works. And it got me thinking, right, again, they should look something more like these abandoned malls where there's like black mold and mildew everywhere, or to say nothing about the kinds of horrific disease, damage, and smells that happen from stagnant water over a large abandoned area. Seriously, it's like a cesspit unlike anything that you've ever seen. If you've never been urban spelunking or helped refurbish an area, I would highly encourage you to do it, to understand what a real dungeon without access to good cleaning is going to look like. It's less glamorous Draugr and more like feral abandoned strip mall. And it got me really thinking, though, that dungeons, as we understand them in a popular imagination setting, need to be cleaned. And what about people who might take that job on? Whether you are the seneschal for the Goblin King, or whether you work for, I don't know, some sort of really haughty race of underground elves, you're going to need to clean those dungeons. And I think in a fantasy setting, there's a couple ways you can do it. I thought immediately, if we're going to keep our semi-realistic, and my low fantasy brain is still kind of kicking in a little bit, trend going, we could talk about growing things like mushroom or lichen to help break down a lot of the decomposing matter that is in those dungeons. A lot of times, mushrooms, especially when cultivated, and lichen or moss, especially when cultivated, can be useful at breaking down dead organic matter in an environment like a dungeon, and it could go a long way to helping to work through and actually filtering some of the harmful things that would come through one of those spaces. It's actually a pretty cool idea. Imagine a society that works to keep their subterranean spaces clean despite the amount of conflict and combat that happens there. Those people are probably going to breed all kinds of interesting fungi and moss that are going to be useful. Stuff that filters the air, or stuff that has medicinal purposes as well. But what if we get even weirder with it, right? I'm not even just talking about druids making something out of nothing, or individuals who learn horticulture 3,000 meters below the surface of your fantasy world. I'm talking about the people that rely on the fauna to do some of the job, and not just the flora. That's right. Like some kind of low-grade demented Pokemon trainer, what if our fantasy dungeon cleaners are using monsters to help them? There's all kinds of monsters in all kinds of role-playing games that could be useful for this. I thought immediately of the acidic oozes of stuff like Dragon Quest, which are really particularly useful. But what about a group of people that have sentient or minorly sapient mushroom folk that they continue to work with, right? Take our fungus idea to the next extreme, why don't we? I think that's kind of a cool concept. Or what about a hydra that breathes acid, or some sort of acid-breathing serpent that essentially does a deep clean of some of those dungeon spaces, breathing disintegrating liquid into all of those crevices. Black mold doesn't stand a chance if you literally vaporize 1 inch of the stone it's on. There's all kinds of things that a person using a crew of semi-intelligent monsters might be capable of doing when they're cleaning it. And so let's have a conversation, right? Stevie Boy decides he's going to move on from the tannery, the leatherworking spot, because let's be real, he thinks anything is better than that. And so he realizes really quickly that he does not have the build of a hero, nor the desire to get up close and personal with something like an acid-breathing hydra to help him clean a dungeon. Although, by the way, this is a tangent. This is some of the biggest nightmare fuel imaginable. I don't think this is a Medusa. I literally think this is a former stump of the hydra's head regrowing into more heads. Like, you can kind of see the fangs pushing against the newly formed flesh, and then more hydra heads coming out. This is nightmare fuel inducing, and it's such a little detail in the original piece. I just wanted to highlight it because I thought it was neat. But obviously Stevie Boy goes, nope, not for me. I'll be the dungeon monster cleaner. And after literal weeks of shoveling all manner of deceased dragon feces, he starts to think to himself that maybe, just maybe, going back to the mill, or even going back to the leatherworking place, is probably not a bad call. And he's like, man, actually, I could just go back to the real world and be an accountant. And then part of his guild pension kicks in as they sell off a massive crate of, I don't know, enchanted rhinoceros tusks, and suddenly he has more money than he knows what to do with. Steve rates it a 5. The work's kind of bad, but the pay's pretty great, and I know a lot of folks in the real world who continue to do a really bad job because the money happens to be really good. And speaking of really good, that brings us to the end of this video, and you are all a really good audience. Thank you so much for joining me along this. If you like what we did here, again, our Patreon, $10 a month, you get yourself a role-playing game, something experimental, something unique that I do just for you guys. If you want to get physical copies, you can get them from Tabletop, Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, or of course you can go to itch.io to get all of the digital copies of our games that your heart desires. And if you want to vote on what I do next, just joining the YouTube community or being a member of our Discord, that lets you get access to those things. But before we go, I have to thank my amazing YouTube members and Patreon patrons: Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Aiden Delaney, Brian, Gurbino the Great, Solution, Alex.vksh, Papa Dinosaur, Chromatic Orbital Strike, Chris Mayer, Darth, Gaming Gambison, Ro.kn, Commander Unidentified, Arcane Bard, Stefan Brosseau, Darjeeling Trailblazer, Michael Torres, David Z, and Joshua Williams. Thank you all so much. You were absolutely fantastic, and I cannot stress enough that I could not do this kind of work without you amazing patrons who make it so much easier to be on a space like YouTube where we don't know if the algorithm's going to hit or not. So it really does mean the absolute world. And to those of you watching in general, thank you so much for joining me. Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You're all amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.